Hello everyone, this is L. Today I want to talk about Shangguan Wan'er. When I was a child, I imagined her as a Jianghu heroine, someone who punished evil and wandered the world in pursuit of justice. The Jianghu is always filled with romantic imagination. It carries people's longing for justice and moral clarity. For many Chinese people, wuxia is something unique. It is a fictional kind of history, but it also reflects the realities of its time. But real history is not about how one person walks the Jianghu. It is about how a power system selects, uses, and eventually discards a person. If we ask which dynasty in Chinese history fascinates people the most, the Tang Dynasty often comes to mind first. It is remembered as a time of strong state power, a prosperous economy, relative openness and tolerance, fewer ideological restrictions, and comparatively higher social visibility for women. But this openness did not mean that women held stable or protected institutional positions. More often, it meant that women were allowed to enter the process of power when specific political needs made their participation useful. Shangguan Wan'er lived in precisely such an era. She was one of the women who came closest to the core of chancellor-level power in Chinese history, often described as a de facto female chancellor. During the reign of Emperor Zhongzong of Tang, she was appointed Zhaorong, a second-ranked court position. Nominally, she was an imperial consort. In practice, she participated directly in major military and state decisions, holding extraordinary political status and real authority. To understand how this became possible, we need to begin with the historical and structural background of her time. From the Wei, Jin, and the Northern Southern dynasties onwards, the Central Plains experienced an extended period of migration, division, conflict, and integration among different ethnic groups. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, these tensions had largely eased. Ethnic relations became more stable, and many non-Han groups gradually adopted Han cultural practices. The Tang Dynasty emerged as a multi-ethnic and pluralistic state. The founder of the Tang Dynasty, Emperor Gaozu Li Yuan, married a woman from the Xianbei aristocracy. Their marriage itself reflected steppe traditions, including the custom of winning a bride through martial competition. In many nomadic cultures, women often held significant authority within the household. This cultural background contributed to the presence of powerful women in Tang society and to a comparatively higher tolerance among Tang men toward female authority. It was within this cultural environment that Wu Zetian's rise to supreme power became possible. In short, Tang culture was shaped by the interaction between steppe nomadic traditions and indigenous Han Chinese civilization. Ethnic integration, trade, and intermarriage produced a society marked by vitality, openness, and the willingness to take risks. It was in this world that Shangguan Wan'er was born. Her story begins at the height of the Tang Dynasty's brilliance, and at the same time in the blood-stained depths of palace politics. When Shangguan Wan'er was still an infant, she was swept into a political storm. Her grandfather, Shangguan Yi, was a renowned literary figure and statesman of the early Tang, often praised as the greatest talent of his generation. He rose to the position of chancellor. Yet, this very man became entangled in the power struggle between Emperor Gaozong and Wu Zetian. At that time, Wu Zetian was just beginning to consolidate her authority. During a dispute over the empress's position, Shangguan Yi took the wrong side and was turned into a political scapegoat. An imperial order followed. Shangguan Yi was executed. Shangguan Wan'er's father, Shangguan Tingzhi, was put to death. Her mother, Lady Zhen, was reduced to palace servitude, and Shangguan Wan'er, still an infant, unable to understand the world around her, was made a palace slave. Her childhood was not shaped by lullabies, but by the cold winds along palace walls and the sound of footsteps echoing through corridors. From that moment on, her life no longer belonged to family or personal choice. It was drawn into a system that was brutally unforgiving, yet profoundly rational. Within the Tang court system, this takeover of an individual's fate first manifested as a form of institutional placement. The Yeting Palace was originally a residence for imperial consorts, but under the Tang Dynasty, it also served another function: the accommodation and management of women from the families of convicted officials who still possessed usable skills. Those with such skills were retained within Yeting. Those without were dispatched to institutions such as the Bureau of Agriculture, where they were assigned to heavy manual labor. Shangguan Wan'er spent her formative years within this Yeting system. Over the following decade, she was not discovered as a sudden prodigy, but gradually entered view as someone who remained inside the institutional framework, subject to continuous observation and evaluation. The knowledge she acquired was not cultivated for personal expression, but came to demonstrate its value as something that could be reliably called upon within the machinery of palace governance. In 677, Shangguan Wan'er, then only 13 years old, was summoned by Wu Zetian. During this summons, Wu Zetian personally set the topic and required her to compose an essay on the spot. The exact subject is no longer known, but it likely involved political implications or matters related to court affairs. Historical records note that Shangguan Wan'er wrote without adding or revising a single character, completing the piece in one uninterrupted flow. Yet, the true focus of this examination was not literary talent alone. What Wu Zetian was observing was Shangguan Wan'er's response under pressure, her speed of comprehension, her judgment, and, above all, her stability in a high-stakes setting. Wan'er's ability to respond calmly demonstrated a level of control and reliability that Wu Zetian valued. Following the summons, Shangguan Wan'er was released from her status as a servant and granted the rank of Cairen, entering the inner court's document system and beginning to participate in administrative procedures. This entry, however, did not place her at the core of power. Rather, it embedded her within the machinery of central operations, where she would be subject to long-term observation, repeated trial, and the constant possibility of replacement. It was under these conditions that the next decade of Shangguan Wan'er's court life unfolded, not as a rapid ascent, but as a prolonged process of accumulating experience, becoming more deeply integrated into institutional workflows, and steadily increasing the cost of replacing her. This seemingly slow progression was not a result of personal limitation, but a consequence of the power system in which she operated. First, the central document work under Wu Zetian was never the responsibility of a single individual. It functioned as a highly specialized team that prioritized continuity and institutional memory. Among its known members were senior figures such as Lady Li, a veteran official who had long overseen the drafting of imperial edicts. These edicts were not ordinary documents, but formal commands that directly carried imperial authority, shaping decisions and execution at the highest level of the state. In this context, accuracy, stability, and confidentiality mattered far more than individual brilliance. As a result, such work relied on collective coordination and accumulated experience rather than frequent changes in leadership. For Wu Zetian, maintaining the stable operation of this document system was a primary concern. Second, this extended period also functioned as a necessary phase of political training. Central document work tested far more than literary skill. It required a keen sense of political boundaries, proportional judgment, and risk assessment. Only through sustained participation in concrete affairs and repeated exposure to complex situations could an individual be gradually permitted access to higher levels of sensitive information. More importantly, Shangguan Wan'er's personal position within the system was inherently complex. Wu Zetian was both the ruler who had destroyed her family and the authority who reintegrated her into the structure of power. Within such a relationship, trust could not be established all at once. It had to be built slowly through time and continuous use. Being allowed to remain within the system already constituted an opportunity. Entering its core required an even longer record of stable performance. It was through the accumulation of these factors that Shangguan Wan'er did not rise rapidly to the position of chief secretary. Instead, over the course of prolonged inner court operations, she gradually transformed from a replaceable participant into a critical node whose replacement carried a high institutional cost. But being difficult to replace was only part of the story. To understand how Shangguan Wan'er was able to survive within this system over the long term, it is not enough to focus solely on rank or seniority. One must also consider how the system regulated individual emotion and behavior. A commonly cited example is the so-called nail knife incident, which appears primarily in anecdotal sources such as Beihulu. The historical reliability of this account is itself uncertain. Yet, regardless of whether every detail is accurate, the reason this story has been repeatedly retold should not be sought in private emotion, but in what it reveals about Wu Zetian's extreme emphasis on discipline within the inner court's decision-making apparatus. According to these accounts, Shangguan Wan'er was ordered to record proceedings while Wu Zetian met with her ministers. On one occasion, she momentarily lost focus and was noticed immediately. It is important to emphasize that within the power structure established by Wu Zetian, such meetings were not private spaces, but highly sensitive political settings. For an official responsible for documentation, any lapse in attention was not merely a personal mistake, but a potential risk to informational accuracy and decision security. The so-called nail-knife punishment, then, is better understood not as an emotional display, but as an extreme and direct disciplinary signal. Within the central system, work itself took absolute priority. Personal feelings and private desire were required to remain fully under control. As for the decorative Huadian later associated with Shangguan Wan'er's forehead, later tradition often links it to this incident. Whether this connection is historically precise is difficult to determine. What can be observed, however, is that the popularity of the Huadian reflects how her personal experience was ultimately transformed into a lasting visual symbol within the palace. It may have served a practical function, but it also fixed her association with the inner court's power center, becoming a recognizable and imitable marker of Tang court culture. From this perspective, the true significance of the story lies not in private sentiment, but in the reality it reveals. Under Wu Zetian's system of rule, Shangguan Wan'er was required to exercise an exceptional degree of self-control, sustaining the pressures of central governance over the long term. Personal life, by contrast, was systematically compressed to the point of near absence. In 683 CE, Emperor Gaozong of Tang died at the age of 55. The following year, Crown Prince Li Xian ascended the throne before his father's spirit tablet, becoming Emperor Zhongzong. This accession, however, did not mark the beginning of a stable new reign. It functioned instead as a brief and fragile transition of power. In 684, Li Xian attempted to elevate members of Empress Wei's family, quickly crossing the political boundaries established by Wu Zetian. Less than a year after taking the throne, he was deposed and demoted to Prince of Luling, then exiled to Fangzhou. At the same time, Wu Zetian installed her fourth son, Li Dan, as emperor. He was barred from participating in government affairs and confined to the Eastern Palace, serving only as a nominal ruler. From this point onward, Wu Zetian ruled as Empress Dowager, governing from behind the throne and reclaiming supreme authority over the state. Although the imperial title formally remained within the Li Tang house, the actual operation of power once again returned to the political system dominated by Wu Zetian. In September 690 CE, 7 years after the death of Emperor Gaozong, Wu Zetian formally proclaimed herself emperor. She changed the dynastic name to Zhou and established Luoyang as the capital. She was 67 years old. With this act, a power structure that had long operated under the arrangement of ruling from behind the throne completed its final transition, from de facto control to formal legitimacy. This was not a sudden usurpation, but the outcome of decades of political practice, gradually tested and refined by Wu Zetian herself. In 696 CE, Shangguan Wan'er began to take charge of confidential state documents, formally becoming the central figure within Wu Zetian's inner documentary apparatus. The consolidation of this position marked her transformation within Wu Zetian's system, from a person who was merely useful to one who was no longer easily replaceable. It is important to note, however, that the full expansion of Shangguan Wan'er's political influence did not occur after Wu Zetian's formal accession to the throne. Rather, it unfolded during the subsequent period of power transition. In 698 CE, the aging Wu Zetian, acting on the advice of officials such as Di Yuanjie, summoned Li Xian back to Luoyang and reinstated him as crown prince, in an effort to ease the growing political pressure surrounding succession. This decision itself signaled that the existing system was approaching its conclusion, while a new configuration of power was already beginning to take shape. On December 16, 705 CE, Wu Zetian died at the age of 82. In her final edict, she voluntarily relinquished the imperial title and referred to herself not as an emperor, but as Empress Zetian. After ascending the throne, Emperor Zhongzong personally escorted his mother's coffin back to Chang'an, where she was buried alongside Emperor Gaozong in the Qianling Mausoleum. Taken together, these arrangements marked the withdrawal of the Zhou regime from history in a relatively orderly manner. During this transition, Shangguan Wan'er was not marginalized. After Emperor Zhongzong ascended the throne, he appointed her Zhaorong, granting her a formal rank equivalent to senior second grade. On the surface, she continued to oversee documentary work. In practice, however, she was now permitted to participate directly in discussions and decisions concerning state affairs, exercising functions comparable to those of a chancellor. This shift should not be understood as personal favor alone, but rather as the continued use of a figure whose experience and systemic role had already been established in the previous phase. With the beginning of Zhongzong's reign, Shangguan Wan'er gradually formed a working alliance with Empress Wei. Under conditions of weakened imperial authority, this was a pragmatic choice rather than an ideological one. Her political orientation clearly extended the governing practices developed during Wu Zetian's era. She encouraged Empress Wei to model her conduct after Wu Zetian's example, including submitting a memorial requesting the restoration of the 3-year mourning period for mothers. She also supported proposals advanced through Empress Wei to delay the age of adulthood for commoners to 23, while advancing the age of senior status to 59, thereby exempting those below adulthood and above senior age from corvée labor and military service. In substance, these measures functioned to reduce burdens at the grassroots level. Yet, in historical records, they are often interpreted as attempts to buy popular support. This disparity in evaluation reflects a deeper discomfort embedded in traditional historiography towards women's participation in the mechanisms of power. Such narrative tendencies form part of the background that cannot be ignored when examining the political trajectories of Wu Zetian and Shangguan Wan'er. At the same time, Emperor Zongzong himself lacked a stable power base. The outer court bureaucracy and the imperial clan checked one another, leaving the political resources that could be mobilized most quickly concentrated instead within the inner palace. Unlike Wu Zetian, however, Empress Wei did not accumulate authority through long-term political practice. She was pushed into the center of power within a relatively short period of time. What she possessed was not a mature system of governance, but a form of influence highly dependent on the emperor himself. Such influence could appear strong during its initial expansion. Yet, without institutional constraints or mechanisms for risk containment, it was prone to turning into a source of instability once amplified beyond control. The relationship between Empress Wei and Wu Sanshi was not a secret at the time. The core issue was not the private conduct itself, but the fact that it unfolded within a highly politicized environment while lacking effective boundary control. When faced with related rumors, Emperor Zongzong did not punish the parties involved. Instead, he chose to suppress those who reported the matter. This response was less an expression of personal trust than a reflection of his practical predicament, namely, the absence of any alternative and reliable sources of political support. Zongzong's continued indulgence toward Empress Wei and Princess Anle gradually weakened the institutional constraints of imperial authority. When influence from the inner palace began to intrude directly into questions of succession, official appointments, and political order, the power structure that had relied on delicate accommodation began to show clear signs of fracture. In 706 CE, Emperor Zongzong appointed Li Chongjun as crown prince. This decision did not resolve the succession problem, but instead was steadily undermined in subsequent court operations. As Li Chongjun was not born to Empress Wei, he remained in a marginalized position, repeatedly subjected to pressure and humiliation from the inner palace and related relatives. More critically, as a symbol of imperial authority, the crown prince position lacked institutional protection, while the emperor himself failed to provide effective support. Under the weight of these accumulating pressures, Li Chongjun ultimately chose an extreme course in an attempt to break the deadlock, launching an armed uprising. Although the rebellion failed, it fundamentally altered the balance of power within the palace and marked the point at which a system of governance dependent on ambiguous accommodation could no longer be sustained. In 707 CE, under the weight of long-accumulated political pressure, Crown Prince Li Chongjun launched an armed uprising, attempting to break his predicament through what was framed as a campaign to remove those who misled the ruler. Although the action had been planned over an extended period, the forces actually mobilized were extremely limited, only several hundred participants. This made clear that it was not an effort at regime change supported by a broad coalition, but rather a desperate gamble by someone pushed to the margins. On the night of the uprising, Li Chongjun led his forces in a surprise attack on the residence of Wu Sanshi, killing Wu Sanshi and his son Wu Chongxun and displaying their severed heads publicly. The act carried strong symbolic meaning. It did not target the emperor directly, but instead sought to force a shift in the existing power structure by eliminating key intermediary figures. However, in the actions that followed, the rebels failed to secure decisive control. Lacking a clear understanding of the palace's internal layout, they were unable to locate or seize critical targets in time, and the decisive window quickly closed. The first to detect the disturbance was Shangguan Wan'er, who had long been responsible for the inner court's central operations. She promptly activated the established emergency response mechanisms, escorting Emperor Zongzong, Empress Wei, and Princess Anle to safety, while mobilizing the imperial guards for defense. Within a short time, the number of guards assembled at the Xuanwu Gate far exceeded that of the rebels, and the balance of power was decisively reversed. With the disparity in forces rapidly widening, Li Chongjun withdrew from the palace. The uprising ended in failure. During his flight, he was killed by his own followers, who delivered his body back to the capital in hopes of claiming merit. The attempt to correct the power structure through violence thus collapsed entirely. After the suppression of the rebellion, Emperor Zhongzong's response once again exposed the logic of weak imperial authority under crisis. He ordered Li Chongjun's head severed and used it to make ritual offerings to Wu Sansi and his son. This act was less a reflection of personal estrangement between father and son than a clear political statement. The throne would continue to uphold the existing structures of support, and any attempt to dismantle them through violence would be unequivocally rejected. The failure of Li Chongjun's uprising brought long-concealed power structures of Emperor Zhongzong's reign fully into the open for the first time. The rebellion did not only end the crown prince himself, it also marked the collapse of the possibility that political stability could be maintained through sequential imperial succession. After Li Chongjun's death, Zhongzong's remaining sons were either too young or lacked any meaningful political foundation, leaving them unable to form forces of real consequence within the court. At the same time, the inner palace group, represented by Empress Wei and Princess Anle, revealed its own structural weaknesses. They were incapable of stabilizing the political order and lacked the capacity to integrate either the civil bureaucracy or military forces effectively. Their actions instead intensified discontent within both the court and broader political society. Under such conditions, the eventual reckoning faced by this group was no longer a matter of moral judgment, but the outcome of structural evolution. With both the imperial succession system and the inner palace faction effectively failing, the only remaining force within the court that still possessed political experience and real influence was the branch of the imperial clan centered on Princess Taiping. She belonged to the legitimate imperial lineage and had long participated in political affairs, maintaining tangible influence across the civil bureaucracy, remnants of the Wuzhou network, and the imperial clan itself. Shangguan Wan'er was not pursuing an ideal form of governance. What concerned her was whether, during moments of power transition, the existing system of political operation could still be preserved and continue to function. For her, personal survival and the survival of that system were inseparable questions. Her shift in position was not an emotional realignment, but the result of systemic judgment. Lacking military authority and unable to shape succession independently, she could only attach herself to the remaining structures still capable of functioning. In 710 CE, Emperor Zhongzong died suddenly. Regardless of the cause, a vacuum of imperial authority became unavoidable. The hurried concealment of the emperor's death by Empress Wei and Princess Anle, along with their attempt to monopolize political control, revealed their own awareness of the fragility of their power base. During this process, Shangguan Wan'er was still ordered to draft the imperial testament. While outwardly complying with existing commands, she inserted a critical clause in the draft, stating that state affairs were to be discussed jointly with Prince Xiang, Li Dan. This was an attempt to preserve a legitimate avenue for intervention by the imperial clan. This action was both an act of self-preservation and the furthest extent of accommodation available to her within the institutional framework. Although Empress Wei rejected the draft, the signal was clearly received by Princess Taiping's faction. Soon after, Princess Taiping and Li Longji joined forces to launch the Tanglong coup. Using Zhongzong's death and the narrative of Empress Wei's disorderly rule, they mobilized the imperial guards and completed the purge of the Wei faction. After the coup succeeded, Shangguan Wan'er's position was exposed. She attempted to demonstrate her stance through the draft testament, yet failed to obtain Li Longji's clemency and was ultimately executed. Her end was undeniably tragic, but viewed through political logic, her actions in Zhongzong's final years were not the result of wavering allegiance, but the inevitable consequence of structural contraction. When imperial succession had failed, external kingship factions generated constant conflict, and imperial authority itself could no longer form a stable center. The power system that once relied on mediation and intermediary operation had been compressed to its limit. In this process, Princess Taiping was not a better choice, but the only remaining support point within the system of power inherited from Wu Zetian that had not yet fully collapsed. What Shangguan Wan'er ultimately attached herself to was never a particular individual, but the remnants of a system that could still function. Yet, once the transition was complete, the survival of that old system itself became a problem. It was precisely this system, still not fully dismantled, that made Shangguan Wan'er incompatible with the new power structure. For Li Longji, the success of the coup was only the beginning. What he truly needed to accomplish was a fundamental reset of how power itself operated. The mode of governance formed under Wu Zetian, in his view, had become the greatest source of uncertainty, one that obstructed the concentration of authority and the confirmation of a single, unquestioned center of power. Shangguan Wan'er's problem did not lie in her loyalty or her stance, but in how precisely she was embedded within that old system. Her abilities were assets under the previous order, yet became risks once a new order was being established. What had to be removed, therefore, was not the individual herself, but the mode of operation she represented. It was at this point that Princess Taiping and Li Longji ultimately parted ways. The former remained grounded in the political experience shaped by Wu Zetian's system, while the latter chose to complete the transition through a clear, centralized, and irreversible break. At the same time, existing notions of legitimacy and rightful order provided a ready-made language through which this purge could be justified. Shangguan Wan'er's death thus marked the end of an era. She was neither a failure nor someone who deserves to be judged through imposed moral verdicts. Rather, she was a figure erased by the new order at the moment a power paradigm shifted, yet remembered by the old one. When authority moved toward concentration and confirmation, the role she embodied lost its place. This was not an accidental personal tragedy, but the inevitable clearing that follows when one mode of power operation is replaced by another.